welcome. Ahead of the snow. We're all going to be okay, I promise you. It is my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Lewis Hyde divides his time between Kenyon College, where he holds the Richard Thomas Chair in Creative Writing, and Harvard, where he is a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. I can also report with admiration, I do so as a person with no mechanical competence whatsoever, that he has worked as an electrician and a carpenter to support himself while writing. He is a poet, essayist, translator, and cultural critic, with a particular interest in the public life of the imagination. His 1983 book, The Gift, Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property, which was reprinted a few years ago by Vintage in the 25th anniversary edition, explores the dilemmas faced by creative artists in a commercial society. In his own words, Mr. Hyde endeavored to defend the generosity of art, quote, in an age whose values are market values and whose commerce consists almost exclusively in the purchase and sale of commodities. Daniel Smith, in a New York Times profile of Mr. Hyde, declares that The Gift has been praised as the most subtle, influential study of reciprocity since the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss's essay in 1924. Mr. Hyde's second book, Trickster Makes This World, deploys diverse representations of the trickster figure in widely separated societies to eliminate the kind of disruptive intelligence that fuels cultural vitality and adaptability. Lewis Hyde is currently examining what he calls the cultural commons, the sum of the numberless acts of human imagination and expression. Specifically, he is interested in the contest between internet-enabled access to the commons and the interdictions imposed by property rights. I suspect that we will hear something about that provocative project tonight when he talks to us about Benjamin Franklin and the liberty to communicate. Join me in welcoming Lewis Hyde.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Wendy. He did such a succinct summary of some of my work that I want to hire him to continue doing that. Supposed to press a button here. Now we get my... Ta-da. Here are two quotes. The benefit even of limited monopolies is too doubtful to be opposed to that of their general suppression, says Thomas Jefferson. The field of knowledge is the common property of mankind. So I've been working on a book that this will come out in August, Common as Air, Revolution, Art, and Ownership, which sort of keys off some of this material of Jefferson's. As you may know, there is a big fight going on in our culture, triggered by the internet and digital copying, over how we think about the ownership and circulation of cultural properties. And what I've done is to go back to the founding generation, trying to understand how they thought about it, people like Jefferson and Madison and Adams. This is one of the things they thought. This comes out of the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So this allows the Congress to give copyright to writers and patents to inventors. I'm going to claim that there's a joke buried in this, or actually what I call the wit of preserved ambiguity. And it's not obvious, I admit that. But the tension is between the word limited and the word exclusive. So as an author, I really get to control my stuff. You're not allowed to touch it. But somehow there's a limit. And so there is a balance set up in this constitutional clause. And that's partly what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to begin, though, by talking about, most of what I'm going to say is things I learned from spending a year or so reading about Benjamin Franklin. And I got interested particularly in Franklin's work on electricity. In the 1740s, early 1740s, people were interested in electricity, but what they saw were basically parlor tricks. They would, suspend a little boy with silk threads and rub his feet with pieces of rosin and make sparks jump to pretty ladies and so forth. And this was amusing, but nobody could do an experiment, really, with electrical currents until this thing came along in 1747. These are Leiden jars, which were the first capacitors. They enabled you to store an electrical charge and therefore enabled you to begin to make experiments. And these appeared about the time that Franklin retired from printing. And when he retired, he says he was going to now enjoy leisure to read, study, make experiments, and produce something for the benefit of mankind. Actually, I'll show you two other quick pictures of Franklin, because one of the things that interests me is the way Franklin has come down to us as a self-made man, and which he was to many degrees. But my argument is that, in fact, when you look at how he did science, what you see is a remarkably collaborative mind. And so there's a sort of tension even in our reception of Franklin historically. This is a painting of Franklin from during his lifetime, 1760 or so, done in England. And it shows him in what is an appropriate, I think, sociable light. That's a bust of Sir Isaac Newton on the left. He learned a lot from Newton's optics that helped him do his electrical experiments. He's reading books. He has papers on his in his hands and so forth. He's wearing bifocals, which he invented. So this is one image of Franklin. This is another. This is like 1816. It's Benjamin West. And it's Franklin as the self. This is a sort of Emersonian Franklin, who we imagine understands about lightning because he goes off alone into nature and sits on a rock, and these little balding cherubs come down and help him figure out. One of them is dressed a little bit like a Native American. That's a nice touch. And there's a little Leiden jar down at the bottom. But basically, this is the solitary genius as imagined by people like Emerson and Thoreau. So now I'm going to talk more about Franklin, how he actually worked. I have some other photographs here which have nothing to do with my talk. I just put them up. I went to Japan, and I was amused by the way they treat. In Boston, when we have a tree like this, we get the city to chop it down. But in Japan, many trees are given little crutches, and I thought that was sweet. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Franklin's work with electricity very briefly. This is going to be a kind of swift talk because I've never given this talk before, and I'm not sure about my timing. So I hope you will bear with me, and I hope we finish in a timely fashion. But Franklin and three pals of his got together in an upstairs room at the Philadelphia State House and did experiments using Leiden jars and so forth to try to understand how electricity worked. And they came up with the first theory of electricity. They really did. And they imagined it as a single fluid. They imagined it as having positive and negative charges. This language appears in Franklin's work. It doesn't appear before. And they came up with the idea that these charges are always balanced. So there's a thing called the law of the conservation of charge. A lot of the terminology we have around electricity comes out of Franklin and these three friends of his who worked. When I showed you that first picture of a Leiden jar, those were actually 6 Leiden jars. That was a battery of Leiden jars. And Franklin is the first person to use the word battery in that sense. He worked collaboratively with ideas that he got from many other people, Newton, for example, and with friends, and exchanging letters with pals in England and reading proto-scientific journals that came out of France and Germany, and comes up with this theory, which he sends to friends in England as letters, and then they publish them as pamphlets, and he begins to become famous. And the pamphlets were then translated into French. And the famous kite experiment, here's a picture of, many people had already thought, because it was obvious, that electricity and lightning were probably the same. This was, in fact, a commonplace. You find it in Newton and you find it in earlier people. What Franklin did was to suggest an experiment to prove it. He was the first one to suggest an experiment. And the experiment it's called the sentry box. He imagined that if you go out in a rainstorm with its lightning and thunder, and the sentry box is to protect you from the lightning, and you stand inside this little hut and put a rod up in the air and a rod into the ground, that you would get a spark to jump between the two. And he writes this up, publishes it in these letters, published in England, published in France. And the guys in France actually first try this experiment. And they were the first to execute the experiment and show that, in fact, it was the case. Franklin didn't know this, and about a month or two later, he did the same experiment here in Philadelphia using a kite. And the kite was used because he needed to get elevation. The people in France went up on a hill, which Franklin had suggested they do. By the way, lightning did not strike this kite. What happens is there's a differential charge between the Earth and the atmosphere during an electrical storm, and that charge alone. The second thing is the kite string is wet. That's why it becomes a conductive element. And then he gets a spark to jump. That's a Leiden jar on the ground. He gets a spark to jump from a metal at the end of the string to the Leiden jar. So from this comes one of Franklin's first inventions. He invents the lightning rod. He says, here's a simple thing we could do to protect houses and ships and so forth from being struck by lightning. Let's put rods up and run them to ground. And within that summer, within months of this, a couple of buildings in Philadelphia were equipped with lightning rods. And Franklin then also published clear, exact instructions about how to make a lightning rod in Pennsylvania Gazette and in, I think the Gazette, maybe also in the Poor Richard's Almanac. And the point about this for me is one of the things about a patent is that to get the right to have an exclusive property over something, you are supposed to reveal it to the public. And Franklin's description of the lightning rod does this, only Franklin himself does not take a patent on this. That is to say, he tells the public how to make lightning rods because, as he says in that early letter I quoted, he's trying to do something for the general public good. I should tell you a quick story about, there's an instructive story I learned about patents. There was an early case in England where two different people had invented a fancy way to make what's called an achromatic telescope lens. It's a special lens that doesn't scatter color light. And one guy had invented this but kept it a secret. I don't know why. But a second guy, 10 or 15 years later, invents exactly the same thing and gets a patent on it. The first guy takes him to court and says, you can't patent that. I've already invented it. I am the prior inventor. And when it gets to court, it's adjudicated that the guy who revealed it to the public by patenting it is the one who deserves the exclusive right. The point being that patents have this utilitarian end, that they are supposed to help move knowledge from secrecy into the public realm. And so there's a trade-off between revealing your stuff to the public and getting the exclusive right. Maybe one thing I should say about that quote of Jefferson's that was on my earliest slide about monopoly. In the 18th century, what we now call copyright and patent and think of as property rights were not thought of as that way. They were understood to be monopoly privileges. That is to say, you were given a monopoly power over the thing that you owned. And the founders were very wary of monopoly privilege in the realm of expression because they had seen that it was a tool of despotism. The monopolies in England in particular had been one of the ways that the Crown controlled printing and controlled many things. And there had been long fights between the Puritans and the royals in England about monopoly power. And being able to suppress monopolies or limit them was an important part of liberty for these people. So, therefore, the term limit on both patent and copyright was important. They were supposed to be given as a short-term principle, short-term monopoly, but not a long-term monopoly. To come back to Franklin and his inventions, the general point here is that when Franklin is working, he's working collaborative. He's working in a sea of knowledge. His genius is partly the genius of a great host, of somebody who's able to absorb the world around him and make connections and do things that maybe other people couldn't do. But nonetheless, he's not the isolato who goes off into the woods alone. He is a very sociable man. And a second example of this that comes back to the question of owning ideas is he famously invents a wood stove, right? The Franklin stove. We've all heard about this. And in the autobiography, he says he had been offered a patent on the wood stove and he declined it. And when he explains why he declines, he points out the collaborative debts he has. And they become obvious if you actually look. Again, what Franklin did when he invented the wood stove was he published a pamphlet that explained how he did it. And I have a picture of the wood stove here. Yeah. This is a Franklin stove. They're very rare. I'll say why in a minute. He explains how he did it, gives drawings and so forth. But also when you read this pamphlet about his stove, it's clear that he's working from 6 books in English and French and German, which contain theories of the transfer of heat and the circulation of air and the design of wood stoves. That is to say, he's tinkering in a collective shop. He's working with other people's stoves. Actually, what's called the 6-plate stove was common in German American communities in this area long before the Franklin stove. So Franklin is working, with ideas that are around him and doing something original with them, yes, but not something that he does entirely alone. So this is just to say, I mentioned the sort of Emersonian claim about working alone. There's a remark in Emerson's Self-Reliance. So Self-Reliance is this mid-19th century essay. If you're down in the dumps and can't get up and go to work, you should read Self-Reliance aloud to yourself, and it will get you out of the house. But, it's full of this you can do it kind of language. But there's a moment in it when Emerson says, insist on yourself, never imitate. Where is the master who could have instructed Franklin? Every great man is unique. So this is the Emersonian claim that there is no master who could have instructed Franklin. But it's a completely crazy claim if you know anything about how Franklin worked. He was a great student. When he was a teenager, he read the Spectator out of London, Addison Steele, and it used it to help him learn how to write essays, or this business about the stove. So this is Franklin, the collaborative man. And then the question from this goes to the question of ownership. So suppose you have invented a wood stove. In what sense can you own it? There's the famous theory about property ownership that comes out of John Locke. And Locke has this chapter on property in his second treatise on government. And he says, you go out into the woods and you dig up a pasture and you plant some potatoes and now you own that field. And the image behind it is when you've mixed your labor with something, the thing becomes yours. And it's a very persuasive and, in many cases, I think, useful way to think about ownership. But it becomes complicated when you think about cultural ownership. Because in the Locke myth, basically he's going into what he imagines to be a vacant area, which he calls America, and mixing labor with something that nobody owns, or that has been given by God to humankind in common. But culture never operates that way. All cultural material, everything we're working with has come from somebody and other people. And so mixing your labor in with already existing cultural materials may give you some kind of a property claim, but it's not clear how much. How much of the stove commerce are you allowed to take as your own monopoly privilege, given that other people know how to make other kinds of stoves? So there's a wonderful remark by the philosopher Robert Nozick, thinking about John Locke and this problem of how you do it when you're dealing with culture. He says, well, if I mix my tomato juice with the ocean, do I then get to own the entire ocean? Or I like to reformulate it as a writer. If I mix my ink with the sea of cultural commons, how much of the commons do I get to then take as my own? So this, in a sense, was also Franklin's position. This is what he says about his own refusal to take monopoly privilege over his inventions. He says that as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. To be sure, Franklin was not a poor man at this point. He could afford to be generous in this way. But it raises this question about at what point does your poverty end, and at what point might you give up your monopoly? Okay, I want to say a second thing about the way Franklin worked and sort of what was going on in the 18th century. I should tell you, by the way, this stove, see the fact that the back has been knocked? Franklin made a mistake designing the stove. The flue didn't work. He made it go down and up. And there's an essay about this in a book edited by R. Bernard Cohen that explains why it didn't work. And so that's why there are very few of them left. And that's why this one had the back knocked out. Because whoever bought it said, this stove smokes all the time. I got out. So here's another tree. Second thing to say quickly about the 18th century that comes back to a particular point about Franklin is this was a period in which guild secrecy was being destroyed. So for centuries in Europe and somewhat in the United States, craft guilds operated by keeping their knowledge inside the guild. So if you were a seaman or a chandler or a wheelwright or whatever, there were methods to your craft, and you did not spread them around. In fact, guilds were called mysteries, and the word had to do with the fact that you're supposed to keep your mouth shut about the secrets. And apprentices who became admitted into a guild had to take oaths that they would not spread this knowledge around. And of course, what was happening, partly because of the rise of printing and in this country, sort of weak guild structure, is that people began, the secrecy of guilds began to come apart. And in Franklin, I'm going to say two things about this. One is Franklin famously was apprenticed to his brother in Boston as a printer, and quarreled with his brother and ran away, and came to Philadelphia. This was a crime. And if you read the autobiography, as he's coming from Boston to Philadelphia, his main worry is that he will be arrested as a runaway apprentice, which he could have been, because he's breaking the law. He's breaking his contract of indenture. And people took this seriously. So, but more generally, there's sort of two levels to this question of craft secrecy. One is around guilds. The second is around technical knowledge as a national asset. And so as you get an emerging industrial economy in the late 18th and early 19th century, nations begin to feel that they would not like the craft knowledge that the nation has to leave the nation. And so almost all European countries passed anti-immigration laws. These were laws meant, two things they were worried about were people taking knowledge about how to, for example, make weaving machines and taking this knowledge out of the country, or taking the people who knew how to do this because they were the craftspeople who tended these machines out of the country. So it was both knowledge and humans who were not allowed to move around under these anti-immigration laws. And I say this because, one puzzle I've had in writing this book I've been trying to do is I'm trying to think about current ownership of ideas and cultural creations, a category we now think of as intellectual property. But that category didn't exist in the 17th and 18th century. The term is entirely, mostly 20th century. So you have to sort of go back and try to think what is an analogous moment or issue in those times. And here's one out of Franklin's life. When Franklin, after the Revolutionary War, Franklin was a diplomat in Paris, and people kept coming to him with schemes for immigrating to the United States. And they would say, help me go to the U.S. The example I'm going to give is a group of calico printers and weavers came to him from England and said, we'd like to come to Philadelphia and set up, we'll start the calico trade in the New World if you, and they wanted help. They wanted money and stuff like this. And Franklin couldn't help them with money and stuff, but this is an interesting remark. He writes a letter to one of them. He says, a special law might easily be obtained to give you a property for 7 years in any useful inventions you may introduce. This is actually, this was what was called a patent of importation. That is, if you were the first person to bring a skill into a country, the government would give you an exclusive right to that skill. And so Franklin is saying, if you come to Philadelphia as calico printers, maybe the state of Pennsylvania will give you a patent of importation, give you a 7-year exclusive right to do this work in the New World. It's of interest because I think it's the only place I've been able to find in Franklin where he assents to a patent right. Makes it clear that he's a pragmatist. He's not a pure commons guy. He's trying to think about how to start businesses in the New World. But the flip side of this actually is, in the same letter, Franklin complains about the anti-immigration laws. He says, they are tyrannical. Such laws make a prison of England and confine men for no crime but that of being useful and industrious. So there's a tension here. From the British point of view, bringing this guy and his calico printers to the New World would be a form of piracy, would be the piracy of intellectual property. From Franklin's point of view, it's not that at all. It's the diffusion of useful knowledge. And it underwrites the liberty of ideas by underwriting the liberty of citizens, such that they can travel, and so therefore ideas can travel. And so you see that then, this is after the Civil War, Franklin is encouraging skilled laborers to break the law in England and come to the New World. But just to read this back quickly, when Franklin leaves his brother's apprentice printing business in Boston and flees to Philadelphia. It is a foundational act of American piracy. This is Franklin the pirate. This is Franklin who believes the freedom of motion of citizens and the freedom of motion of ideas is the more important given the tensions involved. I'm amused actually to find, I read the first Copyright Act that's ever written in this country. It's 1790, and it includes what I think has to be called a piracy clause, in which the Copyright Act says this law does not cover any things written by non-citizens and coming from other countries. So anything could be printed. This was true for 200 years. The United States was a pirate nation. Or, to put it the other way, the United States for 200 years was interested in the circulation of knowledge more than property rights. And it's actually written into the first Copyright Act. I think now if any nation belonging to the WTO tried to write that act, they would be thrown out by our diplomats. But okay. This is end of part one of my talk. Here's part two. Do I have another tree here? Nope. I'm going to come back to this in a second. When Franklin first writes to his friends in England about his ideas about electricity, one thing he says is he's communicating them because he doesn't think he has it right yet. That he has these ideas, but he doesn't think they're complete. He says they're crude and hasty. Maybe I should keep them by me. But imperfect experiments are sometimes useful to incite other people to do better experiments. And then he says, therefore, you are at liberty to communicate this paper to whom you please, it being more important that knowledge should increase than that your friend should be thought of as an accurate philosopher. So liberty to communicate is the key phrase in that. And Franklin there, as and elsewhere, believes that progress in science depends on the conversation of the ingenious, not on individual insight alone. And this was his lifelong practice. In the same line, Franklin never liked to defend his scientific ideas. And there's a letter explaining this that has an interesting remark that takes us back to ownership. Basically what he says is, okay, I've had this idea about electricity, but I'm not going to argue with anybody about it. If it's wrong, it should be proved wrong. And if it's right, it'll stand up to other people's attacks. And then he says, disputes are apt to sour one's temper and disturb one's quiet. I have no private interest in the reception of my inventions by the world, having never made or proposed to make the least profit by any of them. So hidden here is a second principle by which Franklin does not own his own ideas. First one is, hey, I received from others, I should give to others. Here, though, there's a sense that if he has a private interest, if he began to own the idea in the sense of making money off it, it would prejudice him. He would begin to care, it would incentivize him. We talk about these property rights as of incentivizing, but they incentivize lots of things. And it would incentivize him maybe to defend his ideas, whether they are right or wrong. And that, he thinks, might sour his temper. So in this line of thought, disidentifying with your own ideas is a way to have sweet temper. And it's a way of living in the world. And so that idea has implications, of course, for questions about property and also for questions about politics, but it seems to be more psychological or spiritual, a question about how you want to be as a person. And I want to open it up a bit with a remark actually from a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst. There's a British analyst, I presume no longer alive, a man named Wilfred Bion, B-I-O-N. And he had an interesting essay about the problem of whether you could psychoanalyze a liar, somebody who comes in to be analyzed but will lie to you. And he makes a weird claim in this essay. He says, the lie requires a thinker to think. The truth, or true thought, does not require a thinker. He is not logically necessary. The lie requires a thinker. The truth does not require a thinker. So, in trying to explain himself, he compares analytic work actually with scientific work. And it seems to me fairly clear what he's saying if you do it in science. In scientific inquiry, the idea is that the truth of a scientific insight is not dependent upon the particular researcher. That Franklin and his friends come up with ideas about the conservation of charge and so forth, but if they hadn't done it, and once the Leiden Jars appear, somebody else would have figured this out within 10 or 20 years, absolutely clear. So it's not dependent upon Benjamin Franklin or his pals. It's, well, here's beyond again. Of work that corroborates the discovery of others, even if it requires a thinker, it does not require a particular thinker, and in this resembles truths, thoughts that require no thinkers. There's a lot of complexity here, which we're not going to be able to get into. But so, I mean, clearly human minds in general are where certain kinds of truths can appear, but particular minds may not be as necessary as we sometimes think. And Beyond tries to make this clear by stating the opposite. He says, the lie and its thinker are inseparable. The thinker is of no consequence to the truth. In contrast, the lie gains existence by virtue of the epistemologically prior existence of the liar. Again, I'm going to leave this and jump back to the 18th century. In the 18th century, this distinction between the truth and the lie appears more often as questions about truth and opinion. So opinion was the word used in the 18th century to sort of nominate a category of thoughts which could be true, but you don't know yet, and probably also there isn't any experiment you could do to figure them out. In this sense, opinions also are particular. Well, example that Franklin was fond of. He says, you know, in Constantinople, they think the holy day falls on the first day of the week. No, on the sixth day of the week. In London, they think it's the first. And, you know, so there's conflicting ideas about when the holy day is, but you can't figure out, you know, if there is a truth behind them, which you could announce, even if these different contenders got together. The idea being, again, like the lie, the opinion is somehow particular to the place and person who has it. More to the point, opinions are potentially, therefore, divisive. That is, if we could all agree on the same thing as truth, it will bring us together. But if we begin to have contextual and different opinions, we begin to have sects and categories, and it becomes sects and factions, and it becomes difficult to move toward the good, whatever that might be. Now, I'm going to illustrate this line of thought with a story about the Constitutional Convention and Franklin's role in it. So, 1787, all these people gather here in Philadelphia to write a constitution, and they spend a long time doing it. Franklin is the oldest guy at the thing. He doesn't speak very much. He sits in a chair. I think he had a kidney stone and gout. He always looks kind of miserable in the paintings. But at the very end, he gets up and gives one speech. And it's a kind of tour de force of rhetoric. And he begins the speech by saying that he himself has doubts about the Constitution. But, he says, you know, I've lived a long life, and I've learned that sometimes my doubts and opinions are wrong. I've occasionally found that in my opinions I'm mistaken, and that it's only stubbornness that makes me cling to them. And then he begins to joke about people who cling to their opinions and people who think they have the truth. For example, he says, Steele, a Protestant, tells the Pope that the only difference between their two churches is the Romish Church is infallible and the Church of England is never wrong. And he has a series of little, you know, lame witticisms like this about people who cleave to their opinions. But what it's doing, of course, is both showing a willingness to disidentify with his own opinions and prodding the delegates to think about themselves more largely than in terms of their positions. And he says, look, this Constitution has flaws, I'm sure, but it's remarkable anyway. I doubt we're going to get anything better than that. And the key phrase, I think I put this here, he says, I consent to this Constitution. The opinions I have had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good. So this is the ritual by which an 18th century citizen converts himself from an opinionated private person into a public actor. And also, if he can get the whole room to do it, gets a group of people to write a foundational document. And behind this then lies a question about how you conceive of the human self. And what is it to be a public person politically? What is it to be a public person as a scientist or inventor or creator? In both cases that I've done here, both Franklin at the convention and Franklin as a scientist, self-negation is part of the self-conception. That is to say, Franklin says he's willing to subordinate his own position in service of some other larger view. Now, I think that's right, though actually I want to undercut it a bit because it's also somewhat idealist. I mean, it's interesting to work on this 18th century stuff because this was the ideology called civic republicanism. But let me jump from this in order to complicate it a bit. There's a famous remark of Sir Isaac Newton's, and some of you I'm sure have heard this. He's in an argument with a guy named Hooke about who has priority in a certain scientific discovery. And Newton writes, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." So, he's saying, it's like Franklin could say this too. Anybody who does scientific work, I didn't do this alone. Maybe I've come up with something new, but I had to have these giants who preceded me to stand on. There's an interesting, wonderful book by Robert K. Merton, sociologist, called On the Shoulders of Giants, in which Newton is famous for this remark, but he did not invent it. Merton traces it back to the 12th century, and this is the way it first appears. In comparison with the ancients, we stand like dwarves on the shoulders of giants. Now, in both versions, it's a little ambiguous here. So, are we better than the ancients because we see further and they are like our stepping stools? Or are we not as good as the ancients because they're huge and we're tiny? It's not clear. It's ambiguous. There's not a tree. Let me do this with an old joke. There's a story about the rabbi who's walking through the temple, and he comes before the altar, and he suddenly has this fit of religious fervor, and he falls on his knees, and he says, "Lord, before the magnificence of the universe, I am nobody, I'm nothing. Your creation is astounding." And the cantor in the synagogue is off in the corner. He hears this, and he's, inspired to feel the same thing. And he comes and kneels down, and he says, "Lord, I am nobody before your creation." And then the janitor sees, he comes running over, and he lies, "Lord, I am nothing. I am nobody before you're remarkable." At which point the cantor nudges the rabbi and says, "Look who thinks he's nobody." So, in all of this, there's a sort of, the joke is that, of course, the precondition of humility is pride. Now, you've got to be a big guy before you can be a little guy, before you can claim I'm a little guy. And there's a remark of Winston Churchill's, too. He says to a guy in his cabinet about another fellow, he says, "What has he done that he's so modest about it?" So, and I think this is what's going, if you go back to the Newton, I think the Newton line is actually kind of a joke because it's not an obvious joke. Well, what Newton does is get rid of the dwarf, for one thing. He exiles the dwarf. But also, it's an ambiguous remark. It's he has seen further. He's been gotten up on top of the giants, So it's both humility and pride combined. It's kind of nicely done. And this is what I mean when I talk about the wit of preserved ambiguity. That there's a kind of ability to not divide the human passions into an ideal one and another one and try to suppress one. And I say this all because Franklin, when you read him, is very funny, often very funny. And part of the humor in Franklin is this wit of preserved ambiguity. I mean, the famous funny line in the autobiography is when he tries to get rid of his sense of pride, and he says he couldn't do it, and even if he'd gotten rid of it, he would have felt pride in his humility. And which is a line he stole, by the way. He did not invent it. He got it from somebody else, as he always does. And there's lots of amusing turns like that in Franklin's writing. If we had more time, I would tell you more Franklin jokes. But the point here, well, actually, I'll give you, when I mentioned Franklin publishes the instructions how to make a lightning rod, and when he does it, it's nicely self-effacing. He does not sign the thing. He does not claim that he did the kite experiment. He just sort of puts it out there as a truth for the world to absorb. But here's the way his announcement opens. He says, "It has pleased God in his goodness to mankind at length to discover to them the means of securing their habitations from mischief by thunder and lightning." So, basically it's, God has chosen me as his prophet to, there's an inscription on the Franklin stove. You can't read it here, but on the left it says, Alter Idem, Alteridem. It means another one. And he's got the sun up here. The analogy here is when Jonas Salk was asked, "Are you going to patent the Salk vaccine?" Salk says, "No, it belongs to the world. Could you patent the sun?" And that's a nice, act of humility, but you do notice that the comparison is out of the book of Genesis. These are guys working at a very high level who are giving away their stuff. The quick remark is to say, I'm going to wrap this up in about 3 or 4 minutes. This business of self-erasure was a habit of speech in the 18th century. People used to, and Franklin is an example, people used to publish pamphlets anonymously. The pamphlets would typically say at the beginning, the author of this pamphlet has tried to suppress any partial views and opinions that he might have about his own situation and think in terms of the community as a whole. So the opening rhetoric of an 18th century pamphlet is this business of self-subordination. Given that, you have to assume the pamphleteer is a propertied white male, a freeholder who has liberty to write a pamphlet. This doesn't work unless you have that kind of agency. And there's a lot to say about, somebody like Frederick Douglass, who comes along in the 19th century, his pamphlets are quite different, and claiming his name and claiming his place are very important. But to go back to the 18th century and the way Franklin and these others worked, Franklin's earliest essays were ones he wrote as a teenager and smuggled into his brother's newspaper, and they were signed by Silence Dogood. The name is symptomatic of the style. That is, it's not a claim about a personal articulation. It's a claim about somebody who is working anonymously in print to try to do good. And there's a model of the good here that borrows on. What was happening in the 18th century is that scientific inquiry had been so influential and so successful that there was a hope that you could move from the model of scientific inquiry about the true into political and social inquiry about the good, and that it would have a same style to it, that the good would not be produced by individuals trying to cleave to their partial views, but by people who were willing to sacrifice their private opinions in the service of some larger thing. And let me end then with a sort of complexity about this that Franklin himself recognized. When Franklin proposes the library here in Philadelphia, he does what these people regularly did. He does not propose it himself. He walks around and says it's been proposed by a friend of his, and people interested in reading should get together and do this. But when he tells this story in the autobiography about putting himself out of sight, he also says the following. He says, you should try this. This is the way to do public service, is to absent yourself. He says, the present little sacrifice of your vanity will afterward be amply repaid. If it remains a while uncertain to whom the merit belongs, someone more vain than yourself will be encouraged to claim it. And then even envy will be disposed to do you justice by plucking those assumed feathers and restoring them to their rightful owner. So he's saying, self-abnegation is one thing, but in fact, people will eventually figure out who did it. Your vanity could be pleased nonetheless. But notice that it's a kind of complicated plot here. It has 3 stages. First of all, you've got to be somebody in the world. You've got to have this agency enough to act. But then you absent yourself. There's some self-erasure that goes on. But finally, the 3rd stage is that others have to assign you the reward, the merit. You can't do it yourself. Somebody else puts the name on the Franklin Library. You don't do it yourself. So it's out of your hands. This is a status or reward system, which is different from a self-interest system. And in those systems, status or reward systems, it's the community that has to. Civic virtue cannot be self-acquired. Civic virtue has to be bestowed by the community. Now, in the Franklin example here, it's hardly an idealized picture of human motivations. It's vanity and envy motivate the plot in the little thing I just read you. And as opposed to somebody like John Adams. Here's Adams at the beginning of the Revolution. Every man must seriously set himself to root out his passions, prejudices, attachments, and get the better of his private interests. Franklin is a guy who, if he'd read that, would say, well, good luck to you, Mr. Adams. I've tried to do this, and it does not work. You can never root out these passions. What you have to do is figure out some way to have this, what I'm calling preserved ambiguity. And so some people say that, in fact, the U.S. Constitution, this is one way that the Constitution gets described, as it's a structure of ambiguity such that even selfish self-interest could get turned into collective action that might serve the public good. Here's a 19th century senator writing about the Constitution. The principles of a society may be virtuous, though the individuals composing it are vicious. Even an avaricious society can form a government able to defend itself against the avarice of its members. So these are people who are not idealizing the human self. They're realizing that there's interior tensions that have to be worked with. But I want to jump not to governance and the Constitution, but back to the thing I started with, which is the structure, when it comes to science and the useful arts, which is what copyright and patent are supposed to encourage. The question is, are there structures by which self-interested individuals can be encouraged to contribute to the Commonwealth? Can the wit of preserved ambiguity be joined in some way to produce not a tragedy but a comedy of the commons? And the founder's idea, and I think it was a smart one, is that yes, that the early structure of patent and copyright were models of this. That if virtue arises from enriching the cultural commons, then those systems of copyright and patent embody virtuous principles, because both of them respect the urge to gratify self-interest in exchange for 2 things. In the near term, you have to reveal your work to the public. You have to get it out there, and not keep it private. And in the long term, it has to fully enter the public domain. So the tension I started out with between the limited term that the Constitution asks for in giving property rights to inventions and other cultural property and the exclusivity are put into a balance such that we might end up with a lively public domain or a cultural commons that serves us all. And that's my talk. Now, 2 things quickly. If people need to, we're going to have some Q&A, but if people need to go because you have dinner at 6 or something, please don't feel embarrassed by by the calls of your schedule. But let's spend a few minutes chatting with each other. I'm sure something I've said has raised a question for somebody. There's a microphone being passed around, I guess.
There's a liberty to communicate, which is essential to a cultural commons. Is there a concomitant duty to communicate? Is withholding your knowledge destructive?
Well, I don't actually think there's a duty to communicate, but I do think I would reframe it slightly. People who are working on these questions now take the term copyright and flip it over and say we need a copyleft movement, which opens up cultural innovation such that they are more widely shared. But I think copyleft is the wrong term. I think of it as copy duty. And the example I'll give, some of you know this, but the famous early case is the following. Software engineers at MIT in the early 70s had written a program such that when the printer jammed down the hall, a notice would come up on each person's computer saying, the printer jammed, go down and fix it. So they would do that. A few years later, they bought a proprietary printer and its software, and a guy named Richard Stallman wanted to change the software such that it would do this useful thing and notify people in the lab that there was a printer jam. And he wasn't allowed to do it because this was proprietary software and you weren't allowed to look at it or hack it or open it up. And it ticked him off. It ticked him off partly because what was in the software was code that he himself had written. That is, the people who were writing this printer software had, of course, taken from the commons, as you do, and made an exclusive right. And the sort of Nozick question, so they've maybe added something, but how much of the commons did they get to own? So Stallman and his friends came up with a very cunning thing called the General Public License, GPL. And it works the following way. First of all, I write a piece of software, and I take an ownership claim in it. I actually take out a patent or a copyright, so I own it. But then I announce that I'm licensing it to the entire world. Anybody can use it without coming to me for permission, without paying me fees, under certain terms. And the terms are that if you use it, you have to release it under the same terms you got it. So this forces you to treat it as a common property if you took it as a common property. So it's a cunning inversion, and I think of it as an embodiment of copy duty, that along with your participation in the cultural commons, some people feel a duty to have their work move along as a cultural common property, not as a private property. And the whole movement that's arisen recently called Creative Commons is a similar build-out based on this GPL idea. It's a good example of copy duty. And of people who feel that along with, like Franklin, that along with the wealth they've received from the world, they have a duty to share it. And, I'm not an anti-copyright and anti-patent guy. I think they are very useful in a limited form. But I also think that these are useful additions to it. And there's a lot to say about this, but that's a quick answer.
Here's an easy one about Leiden. Leiden must have known something about what he invented, from which Franklin benefited. What did Leiden know about his Leiden jar?
Well, I don't know. The one thing I do know is that the Leiden jar was simultaneously invented in two places. One place, I think in Russia, and in Leiden. And I don't know the story of the invention of the Leiden jar well enough to know what giants those people stood on. You have to assume, simultaneous invention is very common, and it happens because it's often the case that sort of the ground is fertile enough. People have done enough basic research that now there's some low-hanging fruit and somebody's going to get it right away. And so there must have been, experiments around electricity must have proceeded to the point where something began to be obvious, such that Leiden, and it wasn't Leiden, it's the city of Leiden is where this happened. That's why it's called the Leiden jar.
Thanks so much for this one. I first just wanted to appreciate your tree images of preserved ambiguity in the sense that they were sort of asking us which is the humbler, the living tree that requires crop to survive,
Yeah.
or the dead tree with sort of glorious afterlife, or which is the greater at the same time. But I wanted to ask a question that I think was sort of implied at certain moments in your talk, which is if we're thinking about kind of fact versus opinion axis, where is law, and specifically where is the Constitution in of that would be, how do you, as someone who I understand is impatient with, for instance, the decision that the Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998 was in fact constitutional, right? That's the Eldred decision. How do those of us who feel that the Constitution is being, in a way, betrayed or at the very least misread very seriously in that instance by the Supreme Court, try to move that truth or try to move that ossified opinion in relation to the goals that you talked about?
So, two or three quick things. One thing Franklin liked about the Constitution was that it could be amended. And the amendment provision does make it clear that it's in history and things may change. And I mentioned, women, blacks, Native Americans, slaves. That document is not a truth universal. It is full of the opinions, the particular time-based, locatable opinions of its authors. And some of the changes that we've had, particularly around enfranchisement and citizenship in the last 200 years, show both the wisdom of being able to revise the Constitution and how particular it was. It led to a civil war. So I would assume that Franklin, at that point, knows that, it's probably wrong in many ways, but he wants to get the country going. So there's that. A second thing about law, I think the Eldred decision was wrongly decided. This was, in 1998, the Congress added 20 years to the length of copyright, and they did it also retroactively, so that works that were from the 1920s, about to become into the public domain, were locked up again for 20 years. And one reason they did this was that the entertainment industry was about to lose their control over the early sound recordings and movies. And so it was really a power grab on the part of a rich segment of our economy. And apparently you can buy a senator for $1 or $2. And it went to the Supreme Court. People challenged it and said the limited time has been violated. In fact, there was a group of economists who wrote a very good brief on this, saying statistically the new term, which is 95 years for a corporation, is indistinguishable from a perpetual term. If you do the math on the income generated by these terms, you can't figure out the difference between an eternal term and 95 years. And therefore, this is essentially an unlimited grant, and it should be unconstitutional. 6 Nobel Prize winners, including Milton Friedman, who was not a lefty, wrote this brief. So the sad fact is, when it got to the Supreme Court, first of all, I think they're not, they claim to be originalists, but if they had read the history of this, they would have known that this was a clear violation of the statement that Jefferson made. Jefferson wanted that remark, wanted a prohibition on monopolies in the Bill of Rights. And that was the understanding when they wrote the Constitution. And if any originalist tried to understand what limited meant, they would have to peel this back. But basically, the Supreme Court said, we think, they actually said, I was in the courtroom, Sandra Day O'Connor says, this seems to be a stupid law, but it's up to the Congress. So that's the way that happened. And, people have now, this Creative Commons business is a way, okay, now this is the law we have to work with, and try to work with it. One final thing to say of interest to me about the law, there is no plagiarism in legal writing. At a college like this, if you plagiarize without attribution somebody else's work, you can be thrown out. It's a crime. It's against the norms of the college. But legal writing has no such norm. Judges regularly cut and paste from lawyers' briefs without attribution. It happens at the Supreme Court level. And the idea is that the law doesn't belong to anybody. In fact, you weaken your argument by trying to claim so-and-so who's an authority made this. You have to make a logical argument based on precedent. And so the attachment of names is not part of the game. The point is to make the argument based on precedent and the facts and reason. It's a wonderful realm of non-propertied discourse. The argument always is that you have to have property rights to incentivize. Well, there's different incentives in the law, such as the fees. But all right. Another question?
Yes. I have long wondered who wrote Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, the provision you started your lecture with to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. read Madison and Hamilton, and neither of them explain how that came into being. I was able to find a writing by Franklin 2 years before the founding of the American Philosophical Society. He wrote a broadside which had a language of no powers, and then he somewhat paraphrases it. And I wonder if you have any knowledge as to who wrote the provisions in our Constitution, because it has a number of interesting things about it, including the word science meant something entirely different in the 18th century than it does today.
Yeah, science at that time meant knowledge generally. Well, nobody knows for sure, but the consensus in the community that tries to think about it is that Madison wrote it. And the Federalist Papers, the only place where it's defended is one of the papers written by Madison. And the thing most useful I found to read about this is an essay of Madison's that was published, that was written after his presidency and not published until the 20th century. It's called Perpetuities, Monopolies, Ecclesiastical Endowments, something like that. If you looked up Madison and used the word perpetuities and monopolies, you'd find this essay. And the first 2 paragraphs of the essay explain the rationale of patent and copyright in terms that relate quite precisely to the way Clause 8, Section 8 is written. So my answer is, but I should say, I mean, when you find this language in Franklin, it was the currency of the time to talk about the progress of knowledge. That's the way the Statute of Anne is written. It's for the encouragement of learning. These are phrases or commonplaces. And then who actually writes that particular version of it is probably Madison. Maybe one more question or two, if we got them. Yeah?
Yeah, one more, thank you. In Penn's intellectual property policy, which was codified and published as all universities now have to have. And in fact, by the way, if you study them, as I once had to do, they plagiarize from each other remarkably, without any attribution whatsoever. We make a sharp distinction between patent and copyright in an operational way. And the simple explanation behind that is that the university has very little interest in trying to participate in the royalties and other earnings of people who merely have copyright. Because the people like me whose books sell 12 copies and it wouldn't be worth coming after me, but they have a remarkable interest in patent. And so there's a much more aggressive university interest declared in these patent policies. In this book of yours or in your thinking, I take it you also make distinctions between patent and copyright. And it may be far too complex to summarize briefly, but maybe you could give us a sample.
Well, my book is mostly about copyright, and I talk about patent only to the degree that it helps clarify the copyright issue. And it does help clarify it in that famously people say that ideas at a certain level are what's called non-excludable and non-rivalrous. They become different from, a sandwich, which if you eat, I can't eat, whereas if you have an idea, we can share it and so forth. And so the philosophical background of both relate. And the early copyright law is based on early patent law. The one thing to say, though, about the distinction you're making is there's a piece of legislation from the 1980s called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the problem was that universities were producing a lot of useful knowledge which they were not getting into the marketplace. And the positive way to describe the Bayh-Dole Act was to say, let's incentivize universities to get this out there. Let's give them some income stream to do it. And I think that might have been a good idea. I think, and many others do now, that the thing has backfired, because what's happened is now universities and colleges become dependent upon the income stream. And again, the question of incentive, you can be incentivized to create, but you can also then be incentivized to keep your knowledge secret, to refuse to share it, and on and on. And so many people feel that the actual consequence of Bayh-Dole has been to gum up the research conversation. This liberty to communicate business, that letter of Franklin's would not stand up against the current protocols that have followed under the Bayh-Dole Act. And And I think it's a kind of favor of the universities to say that copyright is different. I don't think there's any difference. I think they could come, that's the thin edge of the wedge. There's no logical reason they can't say all university professors are work for hire, and we own your work.
In fact, most of them do say that. They say
Yeah.
work for hire, but we'll turn away. We won't pay attention.
Yeah. So, more generally put, I'm influenced by Michael Walzer's book called Spheres of Justice here, because what Walzer does is to say, look, there are really distinct areas of social life. The army is not the same as the church is not the same as the family, and it's not the same as the college or the military. And there are norms particular to each institution. And he has a simple definition of tyranny, which he takes out of Pascal. And tyranny is the attempt of one set of norms to dominate others outside of their proper sphere. And so I think that industrial biochemistry has infiltrated the universities and is dominating in a way that is wrong and should be resisted. And similarly, the entertainment industry has managed to get universities to sing their tune in regards to the circulation of created things. And universities should resist that too. So on the note of resistance, thank you for listening.